What's good, guys? I know it's been a minute, but I finally had an opportunity to test out the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. Man, that's such a big name, but man, we got some stuff to talk about, man. Let's get into it. First and foremost, before we get into this review of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, I gotta stop saying the whole name. So I'm just gonna refer to it as Blackmagic in this video because I do not want to be saying this whole name of this camera this entire video. Before we get into this review though, I have to give a shout out to the sponsors of this episode, the people over at Lens Rentals. Now Lens Rentals is a shop for online rentals on camera gear. You can rent camera bodies, lenses, lighting, storage options, a bunch of different things. It's a really dope place and I've been using it for a while. Basically what you do is you go online, you place an order for whatever you're trying to get. They give you a return postage stamp, which is used to send it back to them. And it's really just as simple as that. So the camera that we're gonna be reviewing today was provided by Lens Rentals. Now the next thing that I am about to say is super important, so make sure you guys listen to this. They provided me with a promo code to use on their site to give you guys 15% off of your rental. Now with this promo code, I do get a little bit of kickback, but it just goes to credits on my account. I plan on using this account and these credits to review cameras for you guys. It's a bunch of different cameras out there that I would love to review. I just don't really want to put the money up to have to review these cameras that I'm more so not interested in purchasing, if that makes sense. So you guys use this promo code, you get 15% off, I get kickback, we get reviews, it's a win-win. So what I'm gonna do is, up above, I'm gonna place a poll. It's gonna be up here somewhere, and I'm gonna be listing a bunch of new cameras that are out right now. The popular cameras, something that's coming out soon, or whatever the case may be, I'm gonna place it up there, and I'm just gonna allow you guys to vote. And whatever has the most amount of votes by the time we get enough credits to actually rent another camera, that's the camera that we're gonna rent, and we're gonna do a review on that. So you guys choose what we're gonna be reviewing. I feel like this would be something interactive and dope that we can do together. So use promo code YCImaging 15 at checkout on Lens Rentals if you guys decide to rent anything. With that out of the way, man, let's get into this review for the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. I said it again, even though I said I wasn't gonna say it, but let's get into this review for it, man. One thing that I have to do when making these reviews is let you guys know what I do and what I plan on using the camera for, because that in itself can completely alter the perspective of the way you're looking at this review. So me, I make music videos and I make YouTube videos, and that's it. I don't make weddings, I don't make short films, I don't make corporate videos, I just shoot music videos and I make YouTube videos. So take that for what it's worth. So with that out of the way, I had an opportunity to have the Blackmagic for a week. Over the weekend, I went out to Seattle, I filmed a music video, I filmed a bunch of random stuff in the city. So I feel like I got a really good grasp on what this camera's about, what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it. And within this review, I'm gonna be telling you guys what the overall experience and the use was like using this camera. I'm gonna tell you guys my pros, my cons, and who I think that this camera's for. All right, so let's get into my overall experience using this camera. First off, I'll say that it was very similar to that of using like a mid-range hybrid DSLR mirrorless camera like a Sony a7 III or a 5D Mark IV. But at the same time, it was like totally different. Like its name really embodies what it is, Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. This is really a cinema camera, and it houses a lot of the inconveniences and positives of an actual cinema camera. And I'll talk about that in a second when we get to the pros and cons, but this is a real cinema camera. It's not your average DSLR mirrorless camera. This is a true cinema camera. Now, when first picking up this camera, the first thing that you're gonna notice is the awkward form factor and huge screen on the back. This thing is very, very wide. The form factor of it is very different than any other DSLR mirrorless camera I've used. And the overall build of it is very plasticky. It's very hollow. It feels very light when you pick it up. It has literally no weight to it. It feels kind of cheap, but don't let the outside of it deter from what it can do. Like the overall specs and the overall functionality and features and overall video quality from this camera is amazing. It just feels plasticky. When you pick it up, you'll notice that. Now, while we're on overall form factor, the body of this camera has a lot of functional buttons on it, and the menu system on this camera is easily the best menu system I've ever used on any camera. This is my first time using a Blackmagic camera ever, The menu system is unmatched. It's better than Canon, Sony, anything I've ever personally used. This thing beats it. It's so simple, it's so easy to use, and for a first time user, I had no problems navigating and figuring out where the things were that I needed to switch or use. Overall, the use of this camera is pretty simple and easy. I feel like the little annoyances that I was running into was just me being used to using other cameras that aren't really like this one. Now within my rental, the only things that I had were a Metabone Speed Booster XL because I only use Canon EF lenses and a Samsung T5 SSD drive to record all the footage to. Now the lenses that I used were the 16 to 35mm f4 Canon IS lens and the Canon 100mm f2.8 macro L series IS lens. Now I was really selective with the lenses that I use with this camera because for one, it doesn't have in-body image stabilization. So I wanted to really figure out and see if I use lenses that had some sort of stabilization, would it really make a difference if the camera had in-body image stabilization or not? So this is what I used to capture this footage. All right, so let's get into the pros of the camera, the things that I liked and loved while actually using the camera. Now, the first thing that I noticed and absolutely loved while using this camera is that you can pretty much adjust anything while the camera's recording. Typically with cameras like a Canon or like a Sony, once you press record, all of the settings are pretty much locked. Like you can adjust your aperture and your shutter speed and stuff like that, but you can't magnify to make sure that your focus is hitting, or you can't adjust the white balance or stuff like that. When using this Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, you can literally go into the menu and adjust anything. You can go in, adjust your audio levels, you can go in and you can adjust your white balance. You can keep your magnifier on the entire time to make sure you're hitting focus. You can literally do anything within the menu system while this camera's still recording, and I think that's a really dope feature. The next thing that I absolutely loved about this camera, which is so small but it adds so much to it, is the fact that when you use the auto white balance feature on this camera, it shows you the value of what that white balance is set at. Too many times when I'm using a camera like a Canon or like a Sony, when I'm adjusting a white balance, I try to dial it in on Kelvin as best as I can, but if I just switch to auto, I see how good it looks, but I never want to keep it at auto because I don't want it to adjust while I'm shooting. I don't want to switch while I'm going into different lighting scenarios and stuff like that. So I wish it would give you like an accurate readout of what that auto white balance value was. On this camera, it does. And another thing that's really dope about adjusting the white balance on the Blackmagic camera is that it has like a tint value. So you can go left or right on the tint, which is like positive or negative. And it's really just as simple as that. Like if I'm using Kelvin on the Sony, it gives me like this weird like grid where I can go like a wide next axis. It's just too much and it's kind of intimidating to go into. It's really simple to adjust the white balance on the Blackmagic camera. Something so small, but something that adds so much to this camera. The third thing that I loved about this camera is a dedicated high frame rate button. I know on pretty much any camera right now, you can set up a custom menu setup or a custom mode setup and dial it whenever you want to switch from like regular frame rate to high frame rate, but just having that button there is actually really dope. When I was filming, what I would do was I would keep my camera set at 180 degree on the shutter, and then if I needed to go into slow-mo or real time, I could just press that button and go straight from real time to slow motion and adjust my ND accordingly to make sure my exposure was good. And if I ever needed to go back, I could just switch my ND there too. I don't know, it just seemed a lot more simpler than adjusting a dial and going into another custom mode where all the settings were set up for you, like your white balance and all of that. Rather than just having a dedicated button for it. I thought that was really dope. Something so small, but I feel like it added a lot to the overall experience of using the camera. The screen is kind of like a 50-50 for me. It's nice because it's big and it's bright and it's good when you're trying to view what you're shooting, but it sucks because it doesn't move. It's such a bummer, man. It's such a bummer because it's just planted on the back of the camera and you can't adjust it at all. And in the grand scheme of things, I know it doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but the fact that this screen is huge and a lot of the adjustments that you're gonna be doing on this camera are touchscreen based, whenever you need to go in and adjust something on the camera, you have to bring the screen to your eye level, adjust it with your fingers, rather than having like a joystick system on the camera where you can kind of, look at an external monitor and adjust it that way, if that makes sense. So you kind of always have to revert to the screen, and the fact that it doesn't flip or doesn't tilt makes it kind of a bummer to use. So it's kind of like a 50-50 for me. And there's a bunch of things that I really like about this camera, like overall video quality, the no clutter, the function buttons on the body. It's a bunch of things that I really like about this camera, and I can go on, but those are just the things that I really liked about it. Now, before I dive into the negatives or the cons of this camera, I gotta touch on my overall mindset of me going into using this camera, because I feel like a lot of people who are thinking about purchasing this camera will probably be looking at the use of this camera from that exact same perspective that I was coming from before I actually rented and used it. Now, when I went into renting and using this camera, I thought it was just gonna be another DSLR mirrorless camera that I've used before. You know, they're pretty much all the same. They all got the same stuff. They got the same workflows, but this is very different. This is not a DSLR or regular mirrorless camera. This is a cinema camera, a full-on cinema camera. And for the people out there who are thinking about purchasing this camera, you gotta think about that. You gotta go into it with that mindset. And for me, I feel like a lot of these negatives that I'm about to list off all really stem from me coming into this with the wrong mindset of how this camera was gonna operate and the overall workflow that I planned on using it for. So for the people who are thinking about it like that, you're probably gonna feel a lot of these negatives, and a lot of these things aren't actually negatives if you go into it with intentions that this is an actual cinema camera. So let's get into those. Now, the first negative and the big elephant in the room is the battery life. The battery life is depressing. It's awful, it's really bad. Like, for the people who think like the Sony a6000 line and like the Sony a7S II have bad battery life, man, you're in for it. Like, this camera has depressing battery life. While shooting this music video out in Seattle, I literally ran through 5 Canon LP E6 batteries, like five entire batteries. It got to a point where like I kind of subconsciously started like shooting my shots faster because I knew like I don't have another battery, so I gotta get these shots in. And I've never really been in that situation where I had to rush shots like that, but the battery life on this camera is awful, like really bad. The second negative for me is the fact that it doesn't have a joystick. I kind of touched on that in the 50/50 with the screen, but a lot of the stuff and adjustments that you're gonna be doing on the camera are like touchscreen based. So a simple joystick would have added so much to this, and it would have helped the fact that you wouldn't have to always go to the touchscreen to adjust something. You can adjust some settings from the overall external monitor that you're using, like a small HD or whatever the case may be. So I think it's a negative. I think it's kind of inconvenient when you have to adjust certain things on the camera. No in-body image stabilization is also another negative. Not really that big of a deal, but for some people who rely on in-body image stabilization a lot, this is gonna be huge for you. No in-body image stabilization on this camera. The next thing that I think is a huge negative on this camera is the crop factor in certain modes and frame rates, and also the file sizes when using this camera. Now, with this camera, you'll get full sensor readout in certain resolutions and frame rates. Like, for instance, if you're using Cinema 4K, you'll get a full frame readout of the sensor all the way up to 60 frames per second, which is awesome. But if you're planning on using like frame rates of 120 frames per second at 1080p, the crop on it is kind of crucial. And the fact that this is already a micro four thirds sensor, adding a crop to these frame rates is kind of like, it kind of sucks. It sucks a lot, honestly. Like, to already have a micro four thirds sensor and then have that additional crop onto it when you want to use like 120 frames per second at 1080, that sucks, man. That just sucks. And the overall size of these files that you're going to be filming with is pretty big. Like, the camera does have really dope compression ratios and stuff that you can do, but for me, I went big. Like, I wanted to get the most possible quality out of the footage, and I wasn't even using RAW, but my entire music video ended up being 350 gigabytes, and that was at ProRes HQ. I didn't even use the RAW. So for the people who think they're about to pick this camera up and use like SD cards to get their media on it, like, nah, like you're gonna realistically have to invest into some sort of external SSD to actually capture the footage at the best possible quality. So file sizes, they're negative for me. And the fifth negative for me on this camera is form factor. This camera isn't bad when you're doing handheld work. Like, it actually feels really good in the hand. Like, the overall grip of it is nice, but I tried to attach it to my Ronin M and I quickly noticed that it's too wide. Like, the actual camera was too wide to even go into the slot on my Ronin M, and I attempted to attach it to a couple of other gimbals. Form factor just wouldn't allow it. It was just too wide. So if you're planning on picking this up, you're gonna have to adjust your stabilization or get a fix to compensate for the overall form factor of this camera. So these are the negatives for me and why I feel like this camera was just overall inconvenient to use. Now, a lot of this stuff, like I stated, just really stemmed from me going into this review and the use of this camera with the mindset that I was gonna be just using another A7 III or an EOS R, whatever the case may be. This isn't that. This is those cameras. This is a full-on cinema camera, and I feel like you gotta really rig this camera up and utilize it like a cinema camera to get the best out of it. You gotta add a rail system to it in the cage and add a V-lock to get the best battery life. You gotta add an SSD to get the biggest, best possible quality video files. And like I said, I didn't really go into this project thinking about that. And had I done that, I would have enjoyed the process of using it a lot more. The fact that the batteries were just going so fast while I was on set was like, man, this is kind of inconvenient. But like I said, this can all be done with preparation. And this is who I feel like this camera's for. The people who are willing to invest what they're needing to invest into it to make it into a full-on cinema camera. You're gonna have to update your Ronin. You're gonna have to find a solution to put it on your gimbal. You're gonna have to rig it up. You're gonna have to be okay with these inconveniences if you plan on picking up this camera. And honestly, I feel like that is who this camera is for. Nonetheless though, this is an amazing camera for the price. Like, if this camera costs $2,500, it would have sold. What it can do, the RAW, the ProRes is amazing. Overall image quality is amazing. Man, you really can't beat it. This camera is awesome, but I feel like if you're planning on picking this camera up, you gotta look at it with a different eye. This isn't gonna be another A7 III. This isn't gonna be a GH5. You're gonna have to rig this up. You're gonna have to pay the price with storage. You're gonna have to get a V-lock and just carry this heavier and just make it a bigger setup. So that's what I feel like this camera's for, man. If you have any other questions about this camera, make sure to drop those down below. I get to those as soon as possible. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to drop it a like, comment, also subscribe to the channel if you're new here. I'm out, guys. Peace.